On March 15th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar fell under the blows of his own colleagues in the Senate. The conspirators were convinced that Rome would welcome them as liberators. Instead, the city fell silent, and in that silence, they understood they hadn't broken a tyranny, they had ignited a storm. From that moment, their lives were no longer those of politicians. A flight began, and on the other side, a hunt. When the senators emerged from the Curia after the assassination, they expected collective relief, almost gratitude. But in the Forum, no one applauded. The people watched hesitantly, as if they had just witnessed something too immense to comprehend. The Roman people didn't reason in terms of political philosophy, they looked at the facts. Under Caesar, there had been order, food distributed, and land assigned to veterans. The conspirators, however, arrived with an abstract idea of freedom and a still warm body on the ground. Caesar's funeral changed everything. Mark Antony spoke to the crowd in a measured, almost intimate tone. He didn't openly accuse the conspirators. It was unnecessary. It was enough for him to show the torn toga, stiff with blood, and to read the will in which Caesar left money to every Roman citizen. It was sufficient to reverse the city's mood. The square transformed into a tumultuous mass. The benches of the Forum were torn up and used to light an improvised pyre. Torches lit from that fire began to move through the streets in search of those responsible. The violence erupted so rapidly that even the conspirators were surprised. The first casualty was an innocent poet mistaken for a namesake on the list of plot participants. Brutus, Cassius, and the others understood that Rome was no longer a safe place. They had to leave the city in haste, without plans, without protection. The people they said they had liberated were already demanding their blood, and that was only the beginning. After fleeing Rome, the conspirators attempted to reconstruct a semblance of political life in the eastern provinces, but that phase did not last long. The revenge of the triumvirs, and particularly of Mark Antony, would not give them much breathing room. The first to pay the consequences was Gaius Trebonius. Trebonius had not been a mere participant in the conspiracy, his role had been decisive. On the day of the assassination, his task was to detain Mark Antony outside the Senate, preventing him from intervening. Without that maneuver, the entire plan would have failed. Antony did not forget. After fleeing Rome, Trebonius was in Asia, convinced that distance could offer him some protection. He continued to present himself as a legitimate Roman magistrate, trying to maintain order and prevent the civil war from overwhelming his province. But his name was already on the list. Dolabella, one of the commanders aligned with Antony, arrived at Smyrna with orders to capture him. There was no negotiation, nor even a trial. Trebonius was arrested, interrogated, and tortured. Ancient sources recount that his agony lasted several days, used as an example for all those who had supported the Republican cause. In the end, he was killed and beheaded. His head was paraded as a trophy, and according to some accounts, the soldiers treated it with such brutality that it became a warning to anyone resisting the new order. Trebonius's death had a precise meaning. It showed the conspirators that they would find refuge in no province. It wasn't enough to flee, not enough to hide. The power of the triumvirs had now reached every corner of the Mediterranean, and this was only the first name on the list. Among the conspirators, Decimus Brutus Albinus was perhaps the one whose death struck Roman opinion the most, not only for how it happened, but for what it represented. Decimus was not a simple ally of Caesar, he had been one of his most trusted officers, one of the few to whom the dictator had entrusted the command of his legions. He esteemed him to the point of naming him as a secondary heir in his will, in case Octavian did not accept the adoption. Yet, it was Decimus who was responsible for the most intimate act of the conspiracy, convincing Caesar on the morning of March 15th to go to the Senate meeting anyway, despite the omens and the insistence of his wife Calpurnia. This was a wound Roman memory did not forget. After fleeing the capital, Decimus tried to reorganize in Cisalpine Gaul, hoping his old legions would remain loyal, but the political situation had deteriorated. Antony was advancing, Octavian was gaining support, and the conspirators' position grew more fragile by the day. In the end, Decimus's troops abandoned him. Isolated, without an army and without a secure territory, he tried to cross the Alps to reach new alliances in the east. To do this, he entrusted himself to a Gallic chieftain who had once been his friend. It was a choice born of necessity, but also of the illusion that some personal loyalties could survive the political storm. It was not so. The Gallic chieftain had by now understood that in the new balance of power, loyalty to the conspirators offered no advantage. Delivering Decimus Brutus's head, however, could secure him the victor's favor. So, he decided. Decimus Brutus was assassinated in the house of the man he considered an ally. There was no fight, nor any chance of escape. Death came as a foregone conclusion, almost administrative. The head was then taken to Mark Antony, who received it as a signal of the consolidating new order. Thus died the man who, more than any other, had betrayed Caesar's personal trust not on the battlefield, not by Roman hands, but through a betrayal that reflected in miniature the one he himself had committed. With Decimus Brutus Albinus, another important name was crossed off the list, but many still remained alive, scattered across the provinces in flight, ready to discover that the time for protection was now over. After months of preparations and movements, the two main leaders of the conspiracy, Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, found themselves in Macedonia at the head of a large republican army. It was their last chance to oppose the triumvirs and save what remained of the republican ideal that had driven them to strike Caesar. Cassius was the more experienced of the two, with years of war behind him, a strategic clarity recognized even by his adversaries, and a certain prudence that rarely abandoned him. For this reason, faced with the imposing deployment of Antony and Octavian, his plan was simple and rational: do not attack. They would let hunger, disease, and attrition consume the enemy army. But the troops' morale was unstable, and Brutus, supported by many impatient officers, decided to force a confrontation. Thus, on the plain of Philippi, the first battle erupted. The fighting was confused and brutal, and the fog raised by the dust made it difficult for anyone to truly understand what was happening. On the side commanded by Brutus, the Republicans achieved a significant success, even managing to sack Octavian's camp. But on the opposite front, the situation was very different. Antony had overwhelmed Cassius's lines, forcing him to retreat. Cassius, who had withdrawn to a hill to observe the battle, had no way of seeing the whole picture. He saw only smoke, disorder, and confused movements. It was then that he spotted a group of horsemen approaching. They were Brutus's men, actually coming to announce their victory, but Cassius, deceived by the distance and the dust, believed they were enemies. In that moment, convinced that Brutus had been defeated and that the entire Republican army was lost, Cassius made a definitive decision. He saw no way out. He called his servant Pindarus to him and ordered him to kill him. Pindarus obeyed. Death came swiftly, but the cause was not an enemy wound. It was a misunderstanding, an error of perception that proved tragic for him and devastating for the Republican cause, which lost its most experienced commander at the most critical moment. Brutus, when he learned what had happened, wept for Cassius and called him the last of the Romans. But in reality, that eulogy also revealed the awareness that without Cassius, their cause had been irreparably weakened, and Philippi had not yet said everything. After Cassius's death, the Republican army lost not only a commander, but its balance. Brutus remained alone in command with tired, divided, and increasingly disillusioned men. The first battle of Philippi had given them a partial victory, but it had left a deep mark. The only truly experienced strategist was gone. For 3 weeks, the two armies remained immobile, separated by a few hundred meters of terrain. Every day was the same as the last, wearing weights, desertions, internal tensions. Time was working against Brutus. His soldiers, many of them mercenaries, began to lose all motivation. In the end, pressured by his own officers, he accepted a second battle. The result was very different from the first clash. The troops of Antony and Octavian, more numerous and better coordinated, advanced decisively. The Republican lines gave way almost immediately. Brutus tried to reorganize the men, but the battle quickly turned into an uncontrolled rout. It was clear the war was over. Brutus managed to leave the field with a small group of loyalists. He took refuge on the surrounding hills, away from the noise of weapons, but not from the reality catching up to him. The defeat was total. There were no more armies to lead, no provinces to defend. All that remained was a man and the weight of his choices. His companions tried to encourage him, but Brutus saw no way out. He knew that capture would mean being taken to Rome in chains, displayed before the people who had once esteemed him. He did not want to face that humiliation, nor see his cause turned into a spectacle. He therefore asked his friend Strato to help him die. Strato hesitated, but finally agreed to hold the sword. Brutus fell upon it. Thus died the man who, at least in intention, had sought to strike Caesar not out of personal ambition, but to defend an idea of a republic that no longer had a place in the political reality of the time. The death of its leaders marked the end of the conspiracy, and the definitive end of the Roman Republic. Thanks for watching. When Brutus's body was discovered after the Battle of Philippi, Mark Antony, his rival, treated it with a surprising degree of respect. He ordered his own purple cloak to be draped over the fallen general, a final honor for the man he would later call the noblest of the Romans. Antony believed Brutus was the only conspirator who acted not out of envy, but from a genuine, albeit misguided, conviction for the Republic. But Antony's partner in victory, the young Octavian, felt no such sentiment. He received the news of Brutus's death with ice-cold satisfaction. Brutus's head was severed and sent to Rome, a gruesome trophy to be thrown at the feet of the deified Caesar statue. With Brutus's death, the main chapter of the conspiracy was closed, but the story was far from over. For Octavian, the list of the guilty was still long, and his work of vengeance had just begun. The conspiracy was no longer a political movement, it was a list of fugitives scattered across the Roman world, each with a price on their head. What followed was a relentless manhunt. Some would die in distant lands, others would be cut down by sudden betrayals, and many would spend years on the run, looking over their shoulders. The fate of these men paints a grim picture of the era world, where no one who had a hand in Caesar's death would escape the consequences of their choice. Take Lucius Cassius, the brother of the more famous Gaius Cassius Longinus. He was captured shortly after the defeat at Philippi. Octavian showed him no clemency. He was executed without ceremony, and with his death, the legacy of the powerful Cassius family was swiftly and brutally erased from Roman politics. Then there was Publius Cosca, the man who had the dubious honor of striking the first blow against Caesar in the Curia of Pompey. After the Republicans' defeat, he simply vanished. Ancient sources are murky on his fate. Some claim he took his own life, unable to bear the weight of his actions and the hopelessness of his situation. Others speculate he was lost at sea while attempting a desperate escape. His body was never found. For the man who tore the first gash in Caesar's toga, his end is a complete mystery, a shadow swallowed by history. Other minor conspirators met similar ends. Many were hunted down during the proscriptions, their names added to death lists that legalized their murder and the seizure of their property. Some were betrayed by supposed allies while trying to cross from one province to another, sold out for a bag of silver. Others, seeing the armies of the triumvirs closing in, chose to fall on their own swords rather than face capture and public execution. What unites all these men is that not a single one emerged unscathed from the crisis they had helped to create. There was no glory waiting for them, no triumphant political comeback. There was only the dawning, horrifying realization that the act they committed on that March morning had not saved the Republic. Instead, it had unleashed a force that was now building a new world, a world in which they had no place. But amidst the chaos, the betrayals and the suicides, one man outlasted them all. He survived longer than any other conspirator, almost as if he were defying fate itself. His name was Cassius Parmensis. Cassius Parmensis was not a general or a prominent senator. He was a poet, a man of culture, and one of the younger members of the conspiracy. He had supported the Republican cause with intellectual fervor rather than military might. After the disaster at Philippi, he began a long and winding journey as a fugitive that would last for over a decade, far longer than any of his co-conspirators. His first stop was Sicily, where he joined forces with Sextus Pompey, the son of Caesar's old rival, who was leading a pirate fleet against the triumvirs. But that alliance crumbled. Desperate, Cassius Parmensis then made a move that speaks volumes about the times. He sought refuge with Mark Antony, the very man who had vowed to avenge Caesar. By this point, Ideology was a luxury. Survival was everything. Political enemies of yesterday became the uneasy allies of today. For a while, it seemed to work. He found a place in Antony's camp. But fate, it seems, has a cruel sense of irony. Antony's fortunes began to wane. His bitter rivalry with Octavian culminated in the epic naval battle of Actium. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated, and with them, all who had tied their fates to the fallen leader. Cassius Parmensis was on the run again. He made one last, desperate dash for freedom, fleeing to Athens. He hoped to disappear into the vibrant intellectual life of the Greek city, far from the centers of Roman power, perhaps to live out his days as a forgotten poet. But Octavian had a long memory and an even longer list. The names of the 60 men responsible for Caesar's assassination had to be checked off one by one, with no exceptions. Octavian's agents found him in Athens. There was no grand battle, no dramatic final stand. They killed him quietly, without ceremony, about 14 years after Caesar's assassination. His death marked the final, definitive end of the conspiracy. With him, the last of the Ides of March plotters was gone. Think about it. Not a single one of Caesar's assassins died of old age. Many fell in battle. Others died by mistake or betrayal. Some took their own lives in silent exile. Cassius Parmensis held on the longest, a ghost from a bygone era. But even he could not escape the brutal logic of the new age he had helped to create. And here lies the ultimate paradox. Their violent act, designed to preserve the Roman Republic, was the very thing that destroyed it. By eliminating every rival, every opponent, every last man on that list, Octavian cleared the board. He could now present himself not as a warlord, but as the sole guarantor of peace and stability. In 27 BC, the Senate granted him the title Augustus, the revered one. The republic that the conspirators had killed a man to save survived only as a hollowed-out facade, an empty shell. The man they feared would become a king was replaced by a man who became something far more powerful. Rome's first emperor. The 23 stab wounds that were meant to stop one man's ambition ended up paving the way for an imperial system that would last for centuries. And the men who stood in the Curia on that March morning, believing they were masters of history, they all ended up crushed by the very history they thought they could control. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the dramatic events of the ancient world. See you next time.